Fisher, I want to start with a really admittedly broad question about conservatism itself. What was Roger Scruton's concept of conservatism? And I want to throw to you first one of his more famous quotes, say, from How to Be a Conservative, or at least I see this plastered over social media occasionally. Conservatism starts, pardon me, conservatism starts from a sentiment that all mature people can readily share, the sentiment that good things are easily destroyed, but not easily created. So, given his concept of the view we may flesh out oikophilia, how would how would Scruton describe his concept of conservatism as in a very broad sense?
Yeah. So I think picks up a lot, where you see Burke talk about it, you see even Russell Kirk talk about it in a sense, which is it's this disposition. It's a philosophical approach and understanding of the world, an approach where one starts with gratitude. And when you look around and realize that you've inherited this sort of social construct of society in a sense, right? That we live in community with others, we have a home, we have a tradition, we have a culture, we have a political structure that's been built over generations that we have inherited, and it's ours to take forward and be caretakers of. And so, in this sense, I think he goes back a lot to Burke and this idea of trusteeship, right? That society, that our life together is really the sort of trusteeship that we've inherited these political traditions, and it's ours to take care of. As a sort of partnership between the living and the dead, because we recognize, those that have come before us have died off. It's now our turn to take care of it, and we would like, those to come after us to have the same sort of blessings. And that really is, that wonderfully kind of encapsulated a view of it. Now, I will say one of the other things I really love that Roger had talked about. I think this is in a conversation he has with Dr. Hamza Youssef at Zaytuna College. You can find this on YouTube somewhere. But I think, Dr. Youssef is talking to him and says, "Oh, Roger, tell us the meaning. What's the place of the conservative intellectual?" And I think, just coming back to your question, what is conservatism, or how does he conceive of it? It's a really telling, one of these beautiful little audio clips from him, because he says something along the lines of, the role of the conservative intellectual is to give the real reasons for not having any reasons, but merely doing and feeling what is right.
Hmm.
And I think ultimately, that is it, right? It's saying that the natural prejudices in the Burkean sense, not of course, the racial prejudices that we fill in contemporary American society with that word, but good prejudices that are learned and taught over time and inherited in a sense, are good. That hierarchy is good. That these ways that we discriminate within our lives and have been taught to discriminate, for the most part, are good. Though there's room for change and improvement and reform. But generally, what we've been taught is good, and that we should cherish it and love
Yeah, and it occurred to me in asking that question, I probably shouldn't have snuck in the word oikophilia,
it.
um,
Yeah.
because if we don't define that right now, that's going to leave some people scratching their heads. What was oikophilia?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and along with this, I think orchophilia was the way that it was a term Roger coined. I don't know if you first see orchophilia. I think you actually see oikophobia first discussed earlier on in his career, but he really then comes around to oikophilia and fleshes it out as we get closer and closer to today in his writings. But oikophilia is, in a sense, love of home. Coming from the word oikos, so home, and philia, love of, right? And what Roger means by this, Scruton, I should say, means by this, is the love of home, and that means the physical place, not just say the country that you're in, but actually the home that you lived in, the community that you grew up in. These that sort of physical aspect, the structure itself, and the land that it was on, and then also the people inside it. And that means the family structure. That means also the traditions that were practiced by your family, the traditions practiced by your community, and of course, in that can broaden out to a larger understanding of your country. Whether that be, it could be the state, it could be the country in the American and political sense, but it is this all-encompassing idea of a love of home and a recognition, again, going back to this kind of conservative definition and what's been inherited. And I think, well, I shouldn't say I think, I know Roger discusses this, especially in his book. The British title is Green Philosophy. The American one is much longer, but having to do with the planet and the environment. He discusses it and says, this is the starting kind of motivation for any good conservative action, is oikophilia. It's this love of home and this rootedness, this understanding that this is a good thing and we love this good thing and want to cherish it and pass it on to future generations. And so alternatively, then he also has this phrase oikophobia, which you might guess means, the fear of home, the hatred of home. He discusses this at length in a number of books, The West and the Rest. He gives a really great account of it. And I can read some of that later, perhaps. But it's this, what I'd say, what we're experiencing right now in the West and have been experiencing for the last 50 to 100 years is this kind of oikophobic reaction, this cultural repudiation that wants to tear down, wants to destroy, and doesn't have a vision necessarily to replace it, except more tearing down. And it's an easy form of membership, as Roger would put it, rather than kind of a hard-earned one that takes time to become a part of and grow from within. So those are kind of the oikophilia versus oikophobia distinctions and definitions.
Yeah, so I mentioned I should go back to that first part of my question, but I also want to go back to your first answer because you name drop Edmund Burke twice, which is a problem on this podcast as a Burkean. I am going to stop and ask you about Edmund Burke, who I consider to be that's my anchor or guide star, if you will, to the extent that there is one as far as an individual goes. And Scruton, of course, quotes Burke or talks about Burke or kind of attributes a lot of things to Burke. He says here what distinguishes Burke from the French revolutionaries. This, of course, talking about the circa 1790s revolution in France. What distinguishes Burke from the French revolutionaries is not his attachment to things past, but his desire to live fully in the present, to understand it in all its imperfections, to accept it as the only reality that is offered to us. Part of the reason I'm bringing this up is I think if you read Roger Scruton, I think you can certainly detect a lot of Burkeanism in there. And I might ask if there's if there are limitations to that, because there's a lot of people on the right that respect Burke, but don't go as far as he did in certain areas, or say, but here's where I disagree with the guy. All that being said, for Scruton, how much of his, I'll call it, admiration for Burke was not just that he agreed with the guy, but also a shared experience that both Burke and Scruton become, air quotes, conservative by observing what the French got wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and I think that, to your point, there's even a more fascinating similarity in their experience too, because Burke actually starts off as a pamphleteer writing on aesthetics. His first major publication is was it Reflections on the Sublime? Is
Uh,
that what it's called?
it's a longer title, Sublime.
Yeah,
Good
something
grief.
like
I
this.
should know this
Yeah,
after saying how much I like Burke, but good. I
forgive me.
never even thought about
I'm
that, but
with you
you're
here,
right. They're
Josh. So
both interested in aesthetics. Yeah.
yeah, and this is really the same with Roger. I mean, there's you read something like the Gentle Regrets, which is his autobiography, and it's a series of essays and reflections on his life and how he became to be who he is. And you get a sense that there's always some sort of political thoughts and feelings within him, even as a young man, but even more so that culture, that beauty and art was really his first love. And from that, he started looking around closer and looking at societies and traditions that were upholding the things that he loved and recognizing that there were good ways of doing it and bad ways. So I think there's also that similarity. And I don't know if that exactly maps on the screen. I think I or someone else asked him one time and he just said, it's a strange fact of life. And it didn't much more than that, which we were hoping like, oh, this is going to be the key to understanding Scruton and Burke. So anyway, so there is that real fascinating aspect of it all. But I think to your point, Scruton really does pick up on a lot of Burkean themes and keeps them as a sort of lodestar, I think, and really finds his political philosophy grounding and in a sense the basis of all of Scruton's at least expressly political work through Burke. Now you also get interesting other lines of thinking that come through. You get Kant a lot because, of course, Scruton was a big Kantian, and that was his proper philosophical expertise was in Immanuel Kant, as well as aesthetics, which is the philosophy of beauty. But interesting enough, then there's also strange of Hegel that kind of come in, and these all intermingle in a very interesting way. We can get into all this, of course, but intermingle in an interesting way that develop this uniquely conservative approach that has even taken me some time to fully understand and appreciate. insofar as what exactly is happening in Scruton's philosophical work. But that all being said, to get to your question, Josh, I think Burke is this fundamental and foundational piece for Scruton's philosophy. And it's really, this understanding of the trusteeship kind of society, that, the contract, so to speak. I think, Burke's tongue-in-cheek way of responding to the other Enlightenment thinkers, but also I think Roger, picks this up as well as a sort of tongue-in-cheek way to respond to them. The contract between the living, the dead, and the unborn. As I said, to prejudices and discrimination and the proper understanding, and really an understanding of tradition that I think is reflected in some sense in some of the more classical liberal libertarian thinkers, and we can talk about that as well. But grasping onto tradition and saying that there's something good here, and the institutions are actually what matters, not just the autonomy that are allowed through them.
Yeah, I'm not going to let you bait me into talking about Hegel just yet, but I do want to get to that.
Good.
Um, that being said, so Matthew Continetti, I'm
Mhm.
presuming you may know. Well, was that last year? I think it was last year he wrote the book The Right, which is a thick but
Mhm.
surprisingly readable account of American conservatism. I had him on the podcast. He was talking about this, and here's a quote from his book. He says, "My focus is on the writers who set in motions the interplay of ideas, institutions, ideology, politics. My study centers on the authors who planted the seeds of activism, political statesmanship. My interest lies primarily with Americans or immigrants to America, worthy British and European thinkers such as Jose Ortega, Joseph Schumpeter, Mike Loakshott, William Roque, do not factor in the discussion." And what's interesting there is he doesn't mention Scruton in that introduction, but when he was on the podcast, he used Scruton as an example. He
Mhm.
straight up said, "Look, you can love Roger Scruton," and he said, "and I love Roger." Like, he made it very clear Roger Scruton was an important thinker, but he also held Scruton as sort of a, maybe because of him being a more latecomer when this thing we call American conservatism was being formed, that you could understand the majority of what you needed to about American conservatism without ever cracking one of Scruton's books. And so I'm curious here, because given your I guess that's the question, is Scruton fundamental to the understanding of American conservatism? And by the way, I know this is a huge raging debate on the right. Are we talking about conservatism in America? Or are we talking about American conservatism? I'm not necessarily asking you to wade into all that. I just mean, is Scruton someone who is supplemental, or is there something about Scruton's ideas? Because I kind of mentioned this in sort of the green room, that I like to try to juxtapose certain, I guess I would call them foundational thinkers. Certainly, Burke is a
Mhm.
foundational thinker. Now, there are people on the right that would say they have no place for Burke, but you almost have to tangle with the guy in order to explain why you don't,
Yeah.
why he doesn't belong in this pantheon, if you will, of conservative thinkers. Is there something that Scruton brings to the table that is unique to American conservatism that would cause us to put him
Mhm.
on this sort of Mount Rushmore of, here are the figureheads that allow us to define this thing we call American conservatism?
Yeah, no, this is a very good question, Josh. And I mean, something I struggle with too. I run the Roger Scruton Legacy Foundation, and we were primarily founded, or first founded, I should say, as an American nonprofit, and then have since expanded. We have an English charity as well that's established too, doing work in Europe and here in the States, as well as throughout Central and South America, which is really fascinating just to have this wide reach of Scruton. So I think, almost the most applicable example or other, I guess, analogy that we might use for the American context is someone like an Edmund Burke. In some sense, Burke is not fundamental. He's not necessarily even important in American political thinking. Yet, in another sense, he is extremely important insofar as he helps build out this. It's a very much so, I think, Anglo sphere approach to conservatism. It's something that you go to other European countries, and elsewhere throughout the world, especially on the continent, being the most similar, I should say, I guess, in Western conservatism. And there are very different approaches and things that we can learn from and appreciate, but don't necessarily map onto the American experience. But I think, given America first being a British colony, at least for the most part, and that being one of our main intellectual and cultural sources of inheriting our own tradition, there's something important there that we have to wrestle with and tangle with in a sense, and something that can be learned from engaging with Scruton. And again, he's not Thomas Jefferson, he's not George Washington, he's not, you name your founder or Abraham Lincoln or whatever other statesman, or even, in recent times American thinkers, whether it's a more popular political thinker like a Buckley or a Russell Kirk, you name it. He's not necessarily one of these people, but I think he's one of these people that can add to the conversation and should be adding to the conversation. Not to mention that he did spend about a decade living in the States. So there is, some at least grasping and entanglement in our own political ongoings and theoretical ongoings, philosophical ongoings. But I think there's a lot that we can learn from him. And especially, the way I always phrase it with Scruton is, in some sense, he is a perfect case study in loving one's own well and helping us understand that there's more to American conservatism than kind of political dogfights and what policy is being considered now. Is it about tax policy? Is it about how we approach the state and how we're going to fight back the left or these sorts of things? And actually saying no, there's something deeper and more fundamental. And he's just a modern example of a thinker who says this, but perhaps one of the more relatable ones and accessible ones now. But saying there's something more deeper and essential to what it means to be an American, to this American spirit, and understanding that it's not just the idea of America. It's not this idea of a political union where you can achieve economic freedom in some sense. You can achieve prosperity. You can purchase a house. You can live out this dream lifestyle that immigrants throughout history have been pursuing in the United States, but also that there is something more tangible, more necessary to who we are as a people, and that involves our cultural traditions, which can be something so simple as baseball, or our musical traditions, or whatever else it might be. It might be our small town celebrations, and there's all these wonderful examples. You go to any small town in America and you can find, for instance, where I grew up. There's two small cities. I grew up in Central California and rural California, not far actually from where Victor Davis Hanson is. And so my city that was closest to my house was Dinuba, and Dinuba claimed to be the raisin capital of the world. So they would have the Raisin Day Festival every May. And then the city that I ended up going to high school in was Kingsburg, which is a kind of Swedish city. And so they would have, the Swedish festival, and they would have a Swedish queen. Obviously, I use these, small, kind of almost trite examples, but wonderful examples to say there really are local traditions that create a place. And I think as conservatives, or at least now in our American political landscape, we forget about these things, and it becomes just that kind of political dogfight. Everything's always on the precipice. This is the one election that if it goes wrong, we won't be able to climb back from, right? This is always the rising stakes. If Hillary Clinton gets elected, then it's over. If Joe Biden gets elected, then we're done. If Donald Trump doesn't get elected, then we're going to be on an irreversible course. So I'm going on long, I know about this, but I'm just trying to say I think there's something there that is missed in the larger sort of conservative approach that Roger brings back. I think there's that kind of Scrutonian humane culture aspect, right? That says, no, there's something actually more to life than just the political fights. And in fact, politics shouldn't be, so embroiled in this. We should actually be searching for something deeper as a country, as a community, and something beautiful there for us to explore. So in that sense, I think Roger has a lot to offer us. On its face, of course, no, he's not American. He's a very eccentric Englishman, even by English standards to some extent. He lives on a farm. He goes fox hunting, which is a big taboo I've learned, just in my past couple of years running this organization. That's something that's very debated over there, whereas to Americans, it's kind of this quaint, cute British thing that happens, English thing that happens. They would say, oh, yes, it would be quite nice to go on a horse and chase the foxes with the dogs and, this, that, and the other. Whereas there, it's a very, politically contested issue. Um, but I say all that to say, he does give us that, coming back to my original point, he gives us that view as to what it means to love your own well, whether it is fox hunting or your musical traditions or anything of the sort. And I think, if you're really engaging with Scruton, you're then starting to ask yourself, well, what is mine? How do I love my own well? What does it mean for me to be a Californian, or in my sense, living here in Orange County, California, Costa Mesa? What are these local ties that I have to this community? What do I owe it? How do I care for it? And how do I keep it alive so that others can enjoy and appreciate what it is or what it should be, perhaps?
Yeah, and the things Scruton is best known for, his works on conservationism, on aesthetics,
Mm-hmm.
on beauty. Um, it all ties together, right? With that notion of what is mine, what is sacred, what is valuable. Um, And that quote I read quite a while back, that one that's peppered all over social media about conservatism, begins with this sentiment all mature people can agree with. And that's
Hmm.
true. I mean, you can find some of the most radical leftists who still have a conservatism to certain things. I don't know of anybody that is radical in an exhaustive sense of the word. Maybe it's fair to say
Hmm.
nobody's conservative in an exhaustive sense of the word either. Um, but I'm trying to think of how to frame this question because this may be. Uh, hang on, just a second. Take a. When I read Scruton, I get a sort of sense of localism that feels out of step to me to some other voices on the right who seem to be preaching the same thing. And I don't think that they are. I'm not saying that they are, but the localism that leads to the sort of new right nationalism, and that's a broad tent. I by no means want to criticize everyone in it, but that form of identifying this as mine and I want to protect it. I mean, heck, for that matter, Scruton makes very clear he's not a nationalist, although that is a problematic term. It can mean a lot of different things. But how, if you accept that idea I have there, that if there is
Hmm.
a difference between the new rights nationalism, how does Scruton's understanding of localism slash nationalism differ from that of much of what we hear today on the right?
Yeah, I mean, this is a a very on the nose question, perhaps in a sense, because this was something even when I was Roger's student. Nat Kahn had just come out. Yoram Hazony's first book, I think, The Virtues of Nationalism, had come out, and so naturally you're going to ask Scruton, because I was studying with him and getting to see him from time to time. Okay, well, how do we understand this? And he said, look, I understand what Yoram Hazony's trying to do. I think there's some value there. Do I like the term nationalism? Maybe not as much, but especially coming from the European context, I think there's even more feelings there than we have, right, as Americans. But I think he was sympathetic to the project insofar as maybe he would have called it something else, maybe he would have framed it slightly different. But in Scruton's work, I think national loyalty, national identity, these are actually very crucial and important things. But getting back to this idea of who are you, right? This is saying something to who we are as a people, and it's defined by physical things like borders and territories and jurisdictions, rule of law that is imposed on certain actual physical geographical locations, but also cultural traditions and inheritances in that way. And obviously, as I think Hazoni does, Scruton disavowed any sort of blood and soil nationalism and your old kind of Nazi sense or whatever else it might be, or any fascist sense too. But there is that sense of understanding one's place in a society and understanding where you belong, and trying to be as much that as you can be, right? And I think that's in some sense reflective of, and in a way, the American experience or the immigrant experience too, because you actually do move to a physical location. You want to become a part of it. At least you should become a part of it, right? Assimilation, right? This is the big, I think, one of the big questions the West is going to face now, especially with just sort of the unbridled immigration everywhere, not just the American experience, but the Europeans are having a very tough time with this too. Very different context in a way, but also facing a very similar political issue. Um, but really trying to establish what it means to be a culture. How do you come to understand these things? So I'm dancing around the question here, Josh, because I don't have a good answer.
And
You know,
let me, to be
you
fair,
try and
yeah, this is
look at the
a
tea leaves. Yeah,
yeah, this can be a this is a sticky issue. So if,
yeah.
feel free to give me a general response, and we'll, if we need to talk off the recording about how you really feel about some people, that's fine.
Yeah, it's always this kind of sort of divining process I found, since Scruton's passing and taking on this role with the institution. People say, well, what would Roger have said about COVID? Especially in the midst of it when things are still
Hmm.
sticky, and especially in Europe where it was very, very much so a different political issue than in the States. And you can try and divine as much as you want, but ultimately the man isn't here to talk to it. That being said, just looking at the basic facts, he did talk at NatCon, was it in Brussels or somewhere? Wherever the first European was, I forget off the top of my head. He spoke at that. He gave a nice talk about what the things he sort of typically talks about, and I think if you look at oh, what's the book? I'm blanking right now. It's a wonderful little pamphlet. Something about, if you forgive me, Josh, I'll look this up.
No, take your time.
Um, the Need for Nations. There we go. You can find this online. There's a PDF. I think it was published by Civitas, which is an English British think tank based out of London. But it's a wonderful little look at national identity and politics, and Scruton's account, kind of how politics develops over time, and then how you get nations and what these mean and how to understand them, and really pointing us back to patriotism in a way, looking at the patria, as I don't know how exactly to say it. You have to forgive me. I don't have any good foreign language experience there, but really looking at the inheritance, I think, and that again means land in that sort of vocophilia sense, but it also means culture and tradition. And so I want to say, as Scruton would, because he never really took sides in this sort of thing. He made it clear, if you're to try and classify him in some sense, he was in fact a paleocon. But he never got overly involved in the fights, except for saying, well, here's what I believe and here's what others believe. I think they're wrong for these reasons, but I don't, think they're morally bad necessarily, depending obviously
Yeah.
on perhaps what the sin of the person was. But he was always very magnanimous, I think, in that way. And so I try to keep that magnanimous position to everyone too, as much as I can.
No, I I can appreciate the. I promise some of these questions are easier. Um, no,
Sure, just wait till we get to Hegel. We'll have a lot
yeah,
of
yeah, yeah.
fun.
I recall. I think it was shortly after Trump was elected. He was asked like what he thought of Donald Trump, and he said something to the effect of, "I." What he thought was that he preferred not to talk about it.
Yes, I think so.
And I'm sure he fleshed out his opinion at some point, but yeah, it was. Well, and I tell you what, since we've teased this out, since we've teased it out a time or two, let's just talk about Hegel. I'm going to preface this. You and I are both admittedly not philosophers, so there is no there is no pretext here that we're giving some sort of an exhaustive or perhaps even truthful answer at the best of our abilities. Roger Scruton, and maybe this bears, again, in the setup to the question, maybe it
Mhm.
bears saying that Scruton was a philosopher by trade. This was not some hobby he dabbled in. He was, and I think his specialty was aesthetics. But it's very evident in reading almost any one of his works. Okay, this guy clearly has a complex comprehension of the history of philosophy, at least in the West,
Mhm.
and probably broader than that. And so for that reason alone, I can understand there sort of being a admiration for a figure such as Hegel. Um, this is an area though that has long puzzled me about Scruton, because his admiration, say, for Hegel seems to go beyond just the mere this guy was smart and he said some good things. And I will even say he admits in his book Fools, Frauds, and Firebrands that the Hegelian dialectic, he calls it the foundation of the Marxist religion. So I don't think he was like blind to the fact that people took Hegel's ideas in destructive ways. All that being said, my briefs, my limited view of this is that Scruton puts Hegel on a pedestal that I don't know of anybody else that that have been known as quite the conservative thinker as Scruton would ever place Hegel. He seems to put him on the right
Mhm.
side of the ledger, whereas a lot of others do not. Again, I think after this I'll try to ask nicer, easier questions. But why did he do that? What was that all about? Was that a mistake, or are we just not quite thinking at the level he was?
Yeah, well, of course, I'll say Roger was a brilliant man and a brilliant philosopher, and far surpassing me in any sort of, I guess, intellectual ability. And so the way that he approaches this, I think, for Roger, what he was really trying to do was put together some sort of philosophical statement of conservatism, and not just leave it at the simple, well, the given prejudices are good, your inherited traditions are good, and you should defend it. Though he, of course, did say that, and was always trying to affirm, in some sense, the common man, the common perceptions, the clear understanding, even though he himself also very much so appreciated high culture and elite culture in a sense, right? Opera and classical music and all these sorts of things. So there's kind of all those necessary prefaces there. When you look at Scruton dealing with Hegel, I think it's fascinating because what he is trying to do is construct the conservative vision philosophically. And in some sense, I think even distinguish it from perhaps the classical liberal sort of approach, even though, as you see when you look at a figure like Burke, because it is always kind of coming back to Burke in some sense for Scruton, or at least there's that touch point for him as it goes forward. With Burke, you kind of get both that conservatism and that classical liberalism, and these things, in some sense, are always conflicted. And so you always
Hmm.
have the different people claiming Burke, you have the different people claiming Smith. Where exactly they fell, I guess we'll never be able to ask them, at least in this world perhaps. But but so Scruton in his dealing with Hegel, he takes, I guess, what you can say is the conservative understanding, the conservative interpretation, and there's of course the very well known Marxist interpretation, which then goes on to develop all these other things. And I think Scruton also did disagree with Hegel's philosophy of history, and this idea of the end of history and all these sorts of things. Um, but I'll preface this in saying, if you want to learn more about Hegel, we actually held a lecture series on Zoom maybe 2 years ago with Mark Dooley, who's one of Scruton's literary executors, called The Conservative Hegel. And so he spent 4 lectures discussing and trying to help understand Hegel from this perspective. So I'll do a very, very brief snippet of it to give us that kind of philosophical foundation that we can move forward from, because it is, in some sense, fundamental to Scruton's approach. Um, Now I've talked a lot without actually saying anything about Hegel. So to get into Hegel, I think the way that Scruton approaches Hegel is this: that he sees in Hegel a starting point of how we have relations and obligations, and essentially recognition of the individual and recognition of society. And so what he points to in the phenomenology of the spirit is the master slave dialectic. And this has often been used by Marxists to come to a different understanding, or you know interpret different meanings from it. But this is very unphilosophical overview of it. I'll say is this: there's the master and there's the slave, and the contention of wills. Eventually, someone wins out. If they're two equals, they come at each other. Contention of wills, someone wins out and becomes the master, while the other becomes the slave. However, the master does force the labor of the slave, and the slave, in working on the world, starts creating things, and it's really the slave's will, not the master's will, that is imprinting on the world, right? That is actually creating something. And so in this relationship, the master starts to recognize he's nothing without the slave, and really the slave has the power, and it requires the slave to recognize the master, to be the master. And through this sort of understanding and coming to recognition and consciousness, kind of the self and of autonomy, the master will start to feel as if he's not really free insofar as he's impelling these things out of this person, but he's not actually producing anything, he's not doing anything himself. And so eventually, as the kind of story goes, right, the narrative goes, the master and the slave will recognize each other as equals, and this mutual recognition, autonomy is born, true freedom is born. And so this is kind of the starting point, I think, the starting philosophical point that he takes from Hegel, and tries to construct, in some sense, personality, accountability, what it means to recognize freedom in the other. And there's a really wonderful line. I think it's in the what is it? The Good of Government, as I want to say, is the essay. But he makes this wonderful line saying the human individual is a social construct, insofar as we don't recognize ourselves as an individual without recognizing the other person. And in that mutual recognition, we start to realize we have autonomy and we have freedom. But I think what Scruton then pulls from Hegel, that tries to make clear that it's not the classical liberal version or vision, which is perhaps pursuing autonomy to its fullest in some sense. He says that in this dialectic, in understanding Hegel as a conservative would, or at least using this part of Hegel's philosophy, we come to realize that it's through these duties and obligations, both chosen but more importantly unchosen, that we exist as individuals, that we are free. And it's only through those unchosen circumstances, those unchosen duties, that we have to our family, to our community, to all these accidentals, as you would say in philosophy, that we didn't choose, but we were born in a certain place at a certain time amongst certain people, in a particular culture and society under certain governmental rulers, so on and so forth, right? All
Hmm.
these different things
Hmm.
that we actually have obligations to these. And that is what gives us freedom. That is what gives us meaning. And from there, the conservative starts their journey essentially in recognizing that what it is that matters is these mediating institutions. The family, of course, is the most immediate and smallest one, atomic one in a sense, versus the civil society, and then on top of that, the state, and how all these things compete with one another and in some sense face their own dialectic. But the importance for the conservative is to conserve, to care for those mediating institutions from the lowest level to the highest level, and recognizing those come out of civil associations, the free association of people, as well as those unchosen duties and obligations. So I hope this is clear enough, Josh. I don't know if I've done it clear enough, and I'm sure someone listening will have a much better understanding and may gripe about it, and they can completely write in and help me better phrase this for the next time I have to explain it. But that is in a very simple way, kind of that starting point of understanding human accountability and personality, really the dialectic that happens within human relations that we emerge from, and actually goes in contrast to the more kind of Lockean Enlightenment approach, which says, well, social or society is a contract, it's contractual, it's all based upon consent. And then
Hmm.
Thomas Jefferson can take this to extremes in some places, saying every generation ought to be able to reconsent to their structures, and it's very consent based, whereas Scruton saying no, it's not. Or if it is, it's also recognizing that there's something else that allows us to have consent in the first place, and that obligation, that unchosen obligation, matters too.
Yeah, and that obviously brings us back to Burke, the notion of it being not purely consensual. It's a who is it? Um, Jonah Goldberg talks about the tendency of taking two historical figures and putting them together cage match style, like Hegel versus Locke, or Burke versus Rousseau or whomever.
Mhm.
I will abstain from asking any follow ups on that. For not that it wasn't a good response, and I appreciate that, and I think it's the sort of thing that some listeners are going to be really fascinated with, and others have probably left us a long time ago, halfway through your explanation about the Hegelian dialectic. Like, what? That's not what I signed up for.
Yeah.
um, but no, I appreciate that, and like having I've heard various explanations in the past, and there are things that sort of make sense. I'm not saying it's
Mhm.
without the ability to comprehend. It's just kind of an odd fit,
Yeah.
and so it's one of those things that naturally makes you scratch your head and want to ask more about. Um, but I brought up as we both mentioned, there's a Marxist element to Hegel, although it's probably fair to say Marx criticized Hegel too. It's
Mhm.
not like they saw completely eye to eye. Um, it occurs to me one other way, kind of going back to a previous question, one other way that Scruton might have something to offer us that maybe some of these other thinkers, Kirk, Oakeshott, and certainly Burke, would not, is that he only died like a few years ago.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of ways in which the things he wrote about and thought about are more present to us. Now, I know there's a certain sense in which
Mhm.
there's nothing new under the sun, and there's a lot of ways in which what he was drawing on was centuries of Western thought and a tradition. Um, but one of the things, of course, he's very famous for is his critiques of what it's called the New Left, although I think that it kind of developed in the 1960s. So maybe it's not as off, it's not as far off as the New Right, which Peter Varick was writing about in the 1930s, I want to say. So,
Mhm.
but the New Left, the sort of the progressivism that emerged in the 1960s, it was not just an American phenomenon, but was somewhat global. Some of this from the Fabian School, some of it the response to the failures of Soviet Marxism. Um, and I was wondering, can you speak to us about, because having read his book Fools, Frauds, and Firebrands, and as I kind of mentioned before we hit record, Scruton was obviously a brilliant thinker. There are some of his books that are easier to dive into than others, and then that one's it's a good read. He's a good writer.
Mhm.
It's a little challenging though, if you're not steeped in philosophy. Half the time you're like, what is he talking about? But one of the things that impressed me the most about that book was sort of these introduction to these sort of um, giants of the new left, if you will, as far as the thinkers go.
Mhm.
Maybe not the movers or shakers of movement leftism, but certainly the underpinnings of the philosophical understandings and ideas.
Right.
What impressed me so much throughout that book was the degree to which things like tedium and newspeak were used, were employed, and this kind of underlying idea that Scruton has that if by left with a capital L we mean those who resent the world the way it is and are seeking to restructure it. So this is sort of the opposite of the conservatism we're talking about, right?
Mhm.
Um, can you speak to that? What was Scruton trying to get at in the necessity of capturing the language and the way we think in order to advance this sort of understanding that the left has of how the world ought to be?
Yeah. Yeah, this is a very good question. I mean, just to talk about the book generally and then to dive into the question, I think to your point, it is a very good book. And it's one of the, I mean, I hate to say one of the more impressive books by Scruton, but it is in a sense, insofar as he really does take his time going through all the new left thinkers and the Fools, Frauds, and Firebrands is an update to, I think it was originally published, I want to say in the 80s. I might be off on that. Someone can correct me, I'm sure, later. But it was originally Thinkers of the New Left, which caused a lot of outrage. I mean, he actually in some sense ended his proper career in academia, and caused him to leave the
Yeah,
academy full time, or at least was the initiator for that happening, right? The catalyst for that. And so then it was republished, Fools, Frauds, and Firebrands, back in, I want to say, was it 2015 or 16, somewhere thereabout. Updated with chapters on Zizek and Badio and a couple others. Um, just some great language there, talking about all of them. And the great thing is Roger keeps it fun. It's always exciting. But he also has a lot of charity, I think, in it, because the tendency is always, of course, to just demonize these people, to rip them apart and leave nothing on the table. And Scruton, I think, does take his time to try and say something nice, something charitable about every thinker he engages with. And if it's difficult, it's only because the readers themselves make themselves difficult, right?
yeah. He
The
does
language
mention.
of the new left, right? Okay,
Sorry,
please.
I just wanted to. Gosh, and now I'm blanking on who was the guy that wrote "Being and Nothingness." Jean Paul.
Um,
Jean Paul.
yeah,
Was it
Sartre,
Sartre or Sartre?
Sartre.
Okay,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. He does mention that Sartre. He does mention that Jean Paul Sartre looks like a toad, but was very successful with the ladies.
Yes, well, and amusingly enough about Sartre, I heard Scruton speak about this just in more casual settings. But he actually said, Sartre actually really influenced the way he approached his philosophy, because even though he obviously completely disagreed him philosophically on his whole approach, and everything that Sartre wrote, I think for the most part, there was that real sort of humane approach to philosophy. And what I mean by that, it was not only the dense philosophical texts, but Sartre also wrote plays that try to embody his philosophy. He wrote different essays and really tried to engage with the public in a way that wasn't just simply, this dense, dry academic trying to, speak out his philosophy and
Right.
influence his students and whatever else, but really tried to make it relatable and understandable. But to the larger point, I think, getting back to your question about newspeak, the left really does introduce this, or rather the new left introduces this whole new language, and that's partially what makes it so difficult to understand in the first place. I once remember seeing a lecture by Scruton where he's talking about just humane philosophy and trying to give this different understanding and approach to philosophy, and he quotes Deleuze and Guattari's book. It escapes me off the top of my head, but he essentially reads out this sentence that's really a paragraph about bodies without minds, or something like minds without bodies. It's some very confusing phrase, and it never really makes sense. And he just leaves it at that and says, "Well, there you have it. I don't really know what to make of this, and neither do you. So we're both on the same page there." But there's something to that insofar as the language of the new left. I mean, obviously there's newspeak, and he talks a lot about this. And really, from his position, appearances are reality, right? We're supposed to take things at their word. And if you control the language, you control the way people actually understand the world, the way in which they approach it. And so with things like newspeak, and the phrasing that we get from the left, whether it's social justice or now, this reframing of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Chris Rufo talks a lot about this, I think, in a very interesting way in his new book, how it's really been the sanitation of these leftist concepts in the first place, as they try to, then trickle into the institutions and whatnot. This is a way in which you can control and reconstruct reality in your image, right? The image that you want. And rather than trying to understand the world as it appears to you and is around you, and to starting that sort of oikophilia inspired sense where you recognize and are in awe of the inheritance in the world that you received. It's trying to reconstruct it from the top down and offer your own understanding of it. And so this is what you get in Newspeak. I mean, and in some sense, this is also just what you get in their whole philosophical framing. I think Scruton talks a lot about this too. And I'm not diving into anyone too specific, just because it is all so difficult, and I don't even know it that well to be quite frank. I mean, if you want to, I'd highly recommend reading Fools, Frauds, and Firebrands. But there is a sense of membership, right, that comes with understanding
Mm,
how the new left approaches these issues.
hmm.
Once you learn the general framework and how you can, talk about otherizing the people and decentering whiteness, and how we have to really understand the class and sexual tendencies of this, that, and the other. And if we look at Shakespeare, it's not really about these deeper, even philosophical issues that we're looking at. It's about looking at how power and sexuality and male or female femininity and all these sorts of things are interplaying at all times. And once you master that very basic kind of level of understanding, you can then be an expert in anything. And from there, you get membership. It's actually a very easy form of membership. So going back to what we said about this kind of oikophilia again, view of the world, this conservative view of the world, what's required is the hard work of actually living somewhere, of caring for people, of coming to understand what it is to belong. And in this sort of Burkean, even Hayekian, and I think we might get into this a little bit too, just how he appreciates and what he gets from Hayek, Friedrich Hayek, and what he doesn't, or
Hmm.
how he disagrees perhaps. But all these things kind of work together in some sense in that tacit knowledge that requires one to live and be a part of a culture and a community. And through that, you get institutional membership. Through that, you get belonging. And without those things, we're all searching for membership. And I think the way the left speaks oftentimes allows, like I said, the easy form of membership in which you can be a part of something just because you've figured out their language. And as long as you're a good, faithful member, saying all the right things and applying the framework in the right way, well, you're one of us, and we're going to support you as much as we can. Which is true, I think, for any of us, to be frank.
Yeah, it's interesting you're talking there. When I quoted Scruton much earlier in the conversation where he's talking about Burke's contention with the French, is not that Burke wanted to live in some. He didn't want to recall things back to the past necessarily. He wanted to live in the present, in the world
Mm-hmm.
as it was, and it is a very fair critique of the right, and maybe I could even say properly understood, maybe even conservatism, that we do sometimes fall prey to this notion of we want to live in some sort of a, quite frankly, imagined utopic past. I think that is part of the danger of conservatism, but it doesn't have to be. And I think
Mm-hmm.
people like Scruton, people like Burke kind of point us to that's not what this is all about. But it's interesting because Scruton almost turns this on its head in this sort of thing that the left, in a sense, by by being resentful of the world as it is, wants to live in an imaginary future,
Right.
and one that, and of course, it's debatable what that might mean. They're conservatives ought to have some sense of progress or an ability to demonstrate that things can progress. um, but I don't know. I find that fascinating that it's almost like Scruton turns that whole notion of being stuck in the past on its head when presenting the new left. That it's like it's actually the radical left that's out of alignment with reality and seeking to bring about something that only exists in their imagination. I don't know if
Mm-hmm.
there's a question there so much. It's just that's a basic comment.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely it. Well, and Scruton says this throughout that book too, when he's talking about these different people, and some of them who are at least a little bit more honest than others, which, in a sense, is a virtue in its own right. It's at least an
Hmm.
intellectual virtue, being honest and logically consistent throughout it. Adorno, for instance, recognizes, well, we're critiquing the capitalist structure, but what really the alternative is utopia. It's this sort of non-existent world where everyone's completely free of civil society, and yet they somehow just go about in their maximally beneficial ways to form associations and then nod, and everything's rosy and grand, and life's good, and everyone has the means that they need without having to work, and so on and so forth, right? In this very sort of Marxist approach. um, and Scrooge just says, like, okay, there's virtue there. He's at least honest. He's telling us what he thinks. But ultimately, if your alternative is utopia, you don't have a real alternative. You just have another ideological dream that everyone else has, and you're
Well,
not telling us how to
I
go
don't
forward in any real
I don't
sense.
have the quote at my fingertips here, but yeah, that's one of my favorite parts of the book where he talks about when I read in the writings of Adorno something like this, that the only alternative to capitalism, da 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 da. I congratulate the writer on his honesty, but that is another way of saying there is no alternative.
Yeah. Right. Yes, that's exactly it. That's the exact quote I'm thinking of.
So I want to change the topic completely, just because this is an important one. Scruton's fascinating relationship with religion, with theism, with Christianity. I think I've heard you give some talks in the past. That part of the complexity here may simply come from the fact that there could have been some sort of an evolution throughout his life. But Scruton
Mhm.
is one of those individuals that you would place up there. I think he even cites Matthew Arnold and John Ruskin about, look, they devoted their entire life to defending the very faith that they had ceased to believe in themselves. And maybe there is a sense in which Scruton could be put in that group of thinkers on the right. Um, he explicitly says, look, the conservatism he is defending, that he is defining, in no way is dependent upon the Christian faith. And yet he is someone who I think, in a certain regard, would be a defender of the faith. Um,
Mhm.
Now, this puts him out of step, certainly, with a lot of conservative thinkers, maybe even Burke, but certainly Russell Kirk, some of those who
Mhm.
anchored their conservatism to Christianity, or at least to theism. And he even talks about this. Look, there are conservatives that is their anchor, that they don't um, that their conservatism is so rooted in that you can't detach it. Um, so, well, okay. So let me back up and just ask, what was, because I know he wasn't quite Jordan Peterson squirrely about an answer on this, but
Mhm.
you having known him at this level, what was his thoughts on Christianity? He obviously thought it was important. Did he actually believe it?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, and I said this in a recent interview I did on a podcast. I think that final answer is between him and God, and something that I don't know, and we didn't discuss, I guess, in its full entirety, especially at the very end of his life. But we're in enough conversations with him, both individually and as a group, and then talking to other students of his who were, for instance, in my cohort, the class that I did, and when I was studying with him for my master's, we had a very good Thomist. His name is Sebastian Morello. He's a current, I think, editor for the European Conservative, and as any good Thomist does, he would have that sort of gusto and zeal charging into the fray, and would always challenge Roger on some of these things. And Roger was always very good about this. And I heard even in private, he would be coy with these sorts of questions, and he would talk with you and discuss the virtues or perhaps vices of whatever theological thinker that you really admired, as well as long as he knew them or had read them to some extent. But then ultimately, when people would try and push come to shove and change his mind or get him to admit to something, he would play coy and kind of back off and never give you a straight answer. And I think that was just very, very much so his MO, and how he approached it. Because to him, I mean, it's difficult. There's this whole chronology of his faith. He grew up the Church of England, which is say not much at all. Then at some point in his early 20s, I think he ends up joining the Catholic Church. And I was rereading something, or I was looking through something in preparation for this. I forget which book, but he's talking about how really, he believed in everything that the Catechism was telling him that he was learning through the Catholic Church, except for the very first tenet, which is believing in God and accepting His reality. Right,
Hmm.
everything else made sense, and he had no philosophical qualms with whatsoever. But then so he goes through that. He ends up leaving the church. He had actually gotten married in the Catholic Church, got a divorce, left the church, became something of an agnostic, I think, for a time. I don't know if it was ever quite atheism, but I kind of call this post Christianity, where you have a lot of these thinkers on the right, or generally the right, who, as you said, say they don't believe or will commit to skepticism, but ultimately recognize historically, traditionally, culturally the importance of the Christian faith, and aren't willing to sever themselves from it completely, even if they don't actually attend or submit to the church in any substantial way. So that happened for a while, and maybe 10, 20 years. And then in his 50s, when he meets Sophie Scruton now, then Sophie Jeffries, I think right around that time he also starts attending the local parish, the Church of England, and for the last, I think, about 20 years of his life, is a committed member, is actually the organist in his local parish, is very involved in the community, and you get these glimpses every now and then. I mean, he obviously knew the Church of England's, rituals well, and I think submitted to that in a sense. The Book of Common Prayer, of course, and all these different rites. He knew the Psalms. He knew, St. Paul. Like he could talk about the Bible in a very intelligible and informed way, and I think the faith even in a very intelligible, informed way, having read early church fathers and so on and so forth. So I say all to say, it's complex, and there's
Hmm.
no straight answer. And the best I can get, just from the reading and the general grasp I get, is he was some sort of Christian. Whether or not he was a fully, shall we say, small Orthodox Christian and submitted to the full dogmas, just the very basic dogmas and tenets of the church, that will remain in the, just a question to be answered until some later time, some other encounter, perhaps we shall say. Uh, but ultimately, I think he saw the church as something important, and even if it wasn't, it may have been, it may not, again, a theological belief. It was almost a cultural belief in the same sort of Hegelian way. You get these Burkean, Smith, Adam Smith, or even Friedrich Hayek arguments about kind of the tacit knowledge that happens. To go off course and come back to it, because I think it'll make sense. I think it's worth saying. With someone like Friedrich Hayek, Scruton actually really admired Hayek, and in particular, the sort of social epistemology that he
Hmm.
outlined. Especially, you can read this in, I think the essay is "The Use of Knowledge in Society," where he talks about price as this very important social knowledge,
Yeah,
and
Hayek,
it's
by the way,
tacit.
was another
Yes,
name that was, I don't want to say agnostic, but he did not believe in an anthropomorphic or the Christian God necessarily. Yeah, he was another interesting character there.
absolutely. Well, and I know this is weird to talk about an economist and go back to the faith, but I think to use this as an example and then relate it back as this kind of tradition, um, helps it make more sense, because Hayek would say, price is this kind of social knowledge that's tacit, it's dynamic, it's decentralized, but it also forms into its own kind of history, and it becomes an established thing. In the same way, I think Scruton saw, the Burkean traditions as a part of this too, because this is very much so Burke's approach to tradition, as it was this kind of tacit thing, that built up understanding from the inside, and once it was built up, it actually developed its own history. And so you see this in the common law, you see this in the Church of England, you see this in a number of, or in any real church, I think, any established church. You see that sort of development over time that happens when people actually become a part of it, belong to it, have ritual, membership, and all these sorts of things. And as things develop, then they have their own language, their own understanding, and so on and so forth. So I think in this way, what I would say, what I get when I read Scruton on religion, is that sort of cultural, understanding of the faith, especially of the Church of England as a sort of tribal faith that captures the traditions of his people. And
Hmm.
whether or not that means he actually believed in Jesus as a historical person, I'm not sure. Whether or not that then substantiated a belief in the Christian conception of God, Yahweh. I don't know, but I think, in a sense, when you look at his philosophy on the whole, it really is this pursuit of the sacred. One of his most, I think, important philosophical books is the Soul of the World. And throughout this all, it may not be the exact conception of the Christian God, whether from the Roman Catholic view or even maybe a more traditional Anglican view. I don't know. But it is a conception of God, and it's an understanding that throughout the lived world, the sacred, the transcendent, is poking and peeking through every which way. And this is what we're in search of. This is what we're looking for, is that experience of the sacred, and we find that in these things, these objects, these relationships, these art pieces that are ends in themselves, things that are worth pursuing for only, it, whether that's friendship or whether that's art, aesthetic experience, whether that is in some sense religion, where you are there simply to be there. There's nothing that you're gaining out of it except your life, in some sense, right? It's not that I mean, you shouldn't be going to church because, well, it'll make you a better person. I mean, that's a nice
Hmm.
kind of instrumental way to at least get someone in the door, and then from there, hopefully, the faith would expand and grow and develop and mature. But ultimately, it's all these sorts of things, these things of intrinsic value. And I think, in a way, Scruton saw the sacred as being intimately tied to that, and everywhere in what he would call the Lebenswelt, the lived world, this life world, the kind of fabric, the weaved fabric of reality. The sacred is poking through. So this is a very obtuse, I think, answer. You'll have to forgive me here, Josh. It's a bit of an obtuse answer to the very simple question of, what was Roger's faith? But I say also to say it was a very complex, not straightforward thing. You can tell it permeated everything, and yet was completely unclear to most people what exactly he committed to and believed.
Yeah, and for someone who was that unclear, he writes so beautifully about some of these. I mean, he
Mm-hmm.
talks about the loss of faith is the loss of loss, right? The inability to straightforwardly cope with things like death and suffering, and that we have to make
Yes.
light of it and we have to ignore it. Um, that we don't know how to grieve properly. That he talks about the West's response to suffering. Um, is sort of the sacred consecration, if you will, that has a higher purpose,
Mm-hmm.
and that it is only through faith that we can attain these things. And I think it's amazing the degree to which he strikes at the heart of Christianity without ever, at least verbally, fully embracing Christianity.
Yes.
Um, he also talks about beauty as being a source of, I guess, strength in the face of a world of loss. And he, again, his profession being a professional philosopher who specializes in aesthetics. um I'm going to admittedly shrink all of that down to maybe just a single question about beauty, but or rather, we're not going to do him justice here. But I'm curious because another British thinker I admire, C.S. Lewis, and of
Mm-hmm.
course, one of his more famous books, The Abolition of Man, he talks about this notion of the objectivity of certain aesthetic values.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and he uses the example, it starts off about this school book that he's critiquing. He doesn't give the name of the authors. He gives them fictitious names. He doesn't give the name of the book. He doesn't want to, cast aspersions on them, but he has nothing nice to say about the book. And he talks about how, like, throughout the book, there's a story. I can't remember if it was Milton or somebody, anyhow. The authors are talking about this common story in which the character looks at a waterfall and declares that it is sublime. And the
Mm-hmm.
commentary of the authors is that when this character said it was sublime, all he was really doing was describing his feeling toward the waterfall. He was in no way describing some attribute of the actual waterfall.
Mm-hmm.
And Lewis takes great umbrage with this, um, which is a really peculiar place, I think, to begin your critique of moral relativism, is whether or not a waterfall is sublime in a capital T truth sense of the word. But he uses this as a launching off point to talk about this whole notion that there are things that merit our attention,
Mm-hmm.
um, things that are intrinsically beautiful, whether or not you recognize them as such. Um, Now, I happen to believe this is true, but this is also something that I don't think could ever be exhaustively true. That beauty
Yeah.
can't be capital O objectively something out there, that I can look at it and you can look at it and you may disagree it's beautiful and I might say it is, and it turns out one of us is right and one of us is wrong. So I'm wondering, because I had heard you give a talk on this before, that Scruton had an interesting objective versus subjective concept of beauty, and I was wondering, can you just present to us what was his understanding of whether or not beauty is in fact objective or subjective?
Yeah. Yeah. No, this is a very good question. I have to just first say I love The Abolition of Man, so a great reference there,
Yeah.
Josh. Um, who can't love it? It's one of the okay, we can come up with a list of people who can't love it, but anyways, a worthwhile read. What's interesting with Scruton, and when you talk about things like beauty and the aesthetic experience, is trying to understand how we describe the art piece, the art object, right? And so necessarily in some sense we are talking in metaphor, and that's just the nature of these things. When you talk about something being blue, i.e. jazz being blue or whatever it might be, you're not actually saying it has physical quality traits of being blue, but there's something about blueness meaning sadness that's being present, all these sorts of things, right? So Roger gives this wonderful account of metaphors and how we really understand these things, and this is the best way we have to describe these sorts of things, because in some sense they are that sort of intrinsic value. There's not that simple quality character, even though perhaps you might look at a piece of art, a painting, and be able to talk about its form and the color theory and how this paint, this color goes into that one and his use of the brush stroke and so on and so forth. But really what we're encountering is something deeper there, and something more meaningful. And that gets into another philosophical concept that we don't have to go there because I'm recognize we're going on quite long here, called cognitive dualism. I'll just throw that out there as a little, maybe we can pick up on that next. But when Roger starts talking about objectivity, I think you're right. He, interestingly enough, I think at a Catholic University of America talk he did once as well. So you get this in his little book on beauty, the Oxford publication. Says he actually doesn't think beauty is a transcendental. He disagrees with this view. And it's not mapping onto the transcendent necessarily in that way, insofar as there's an objective standard of beauty, where we can say, well, this is by objective standards beautiful, and this is not, and et cetera, et cetera. The way that you see beauty is it's obviously, he just gives a very simple definition that it's something that you recognize, you see something beautiful and it's beautiful, right? But in trying to communicate that, he says, there's almost an objectivity through subjectivity. So using Immanuel Kant's, the philosopher's kind of phrasing and thoughts on this, that we're all suitors for agreement. In some sense, we're all trying to agree. And whenever we make any sort of rational argument about something, we're trying to necessarily convince someone because we're creating a rational argument. There's something to engage with, and it's a form of reasoning that other people will then try and understand and ask themselves, is this true? Is this not? At least anyone of goodwill and good sense would be doing that sort of thing. So he says, within this, in our experience of art, if we do think something's beautiful, it's of an excellent quality or whatever like that, or whatever it might be, we actually do make judgments, and we're able to make moral judgments on art pieces. And that says something, to Lewis's point, that says something about our experience of art and what that all means. But to this very specific question of understanding objectivity within subjectivity, he says through this, we obviously have subjective experience. We all have taste, and taste actually matters, right? And that's formed and shaped in various ways. But by having these subjective experiences, we're all forming and almost postulating what this art piece means. And as we form that rational expression and understanding of this piece, we try and explain it to others. And over time, these understandings of art pieces actually do submit in some sense to an objective understanding. Obviously, they can be questioned and developed in some way, but through this subjectivity, we achieve some sort of objectivity. It's a very interesting, argument, and one that you don't often encounter, because I think, on the right, or as Christians, we often want to say, well, no, beauty is objective, it's a standard, it's, God given. And this goes, of course, I think, to Roger in some sense. But the difficulty is with it all is, well, there is some subjectivity, and obviously we can appreciate different art pieces for different qualities. That doesn't necessarily make them, well, no, it does make them good or bad. I think we can actually distinguish art pieces, and that's an important thing that I don't want to get away from, so I shouldn't say that.
Mm-hmm.
But there is that reality that we have to figure out and actually argue over these things, and it's not immediately present which piece. I mean, sometimes it is, but for the most part, we'll say, we can generalize nicely here. It's not immediately present which piece is better, but we have the ability, the reason, the rationality to be able to argue over these things and come to some sort of agreement, and develop reasoning as to why this piece is good and why it's better than that piece. Whether that's the Mona Lisa is better than Botticelli's Venus, or whatever it might be, or the opposite way, right? But when we look at that, we should be able to articulate and form those opinions, form and articulate those opinions, and be able to convince the others, because that's necessarily what we're trying to do when we articulate those opinions. Does that make
Just
sense?
yeah. So, out of curiosity, do you think that, because again, in the Abolition of Man, I didn't get the sense that Lewis was trying to was not necessarily trying to say beauty is objectively this, that, or the other, something like that we can measure.
Mm-hmm.
But he was definitely saying we have a responsibility to tune our taste buds, if you will, to
Mm-hmm.
things that are objectively beautiful, and to
Yes.
recognize when something is not
Yeah.
beautiful. And it doesn't mean it can't be enjoyable, and it doesn't mean we have to abstain from it, but that we ought
Right.
to conform ourselves to standards of beauty and not the other way around. Is that something that Scruton would have agreed with?
I think so, because he spends a lot of time in a lot of his books, whether that's in modern culture, or if you want to get real philosophical, you can look at something like the aesthetics of music. But there's a lot of discussion and time spent thinking about taste and recognizing, one must actually have good taste. And he, from here, he takes, Aristotle's discussion of virtue, and kind of the example of the virtuous man. The only way to become virtuous in some senses is to look to someone who is virtuous and say, well, what would they do in this sense, in this instance? How would they approach this issue? And so in the same way, we're challenged to develop our taste. When we see someone who actually is of good taste, we ought to be able to develop it. And obviously, you might be able to give someone who's never had fine food a very fine French meal or something like this that would be absolutely delicious and deemed one of the best dishes on the planet. But if all they ever ate was Kraft mac and cheese and hamburger helper burgers, they're not going to have the taste buds or the awareness that this isn't actually, I mean, maybe if they, they had a really good piece of meat or whatever that just melted in your mouth, but maybe then they would say, well, I actually really like my meat, cooked as hard can be and thoroughly well done, and therefore this piece is disgusting and whatever else, So
Hmm.
there's that real question of taste where you can say, well, no, that is actually a very fine culinary dish, but you just simply don't have the taste, and that's not. I mean, in some senses, that might be a moral failing, depending on what exactly we're talking about, but it shouldn't be necessarily. At least in the realm of food, though, it's bad to waste such delicious food. But that's neither here nor there. But in developing taste, I think that really is important. And so, like I said, he takes Aristotle's approach to this and looking to a role model, an example, and saying, well, what would they say? What would they listen to? What would they appreciate? And that's the way in which we actually develop good taste of our own and are then able to repeat that process and hopefully through that process come to find things that we love and want to share with others, because that is ultimately how this cultural tradition, this knowledge that we've gained over a lifetime can be passed on and can be appreciated by future generations, and really live up to that conservative mission and vision I think that we have for life, for our societies, for our cultures.
So I'm going to close by bundling two questions into one. The first is Scruton wrote a lot more than
Yes.
most people. He published a lot more books than most people. And so it obviously invites the question. And I, as we've been talking here, I don't want the listener to get confused. There are some accessible, I'll say, Scruton text. He's a very good writer. He's a warm writer. He's an enjoyable writer. Um, and so, if someone wants to get started with Scruton, and we can throw in some hard text there too, but I'm wondering what your
Mhm.
recommendations for those who are like, I don't care about Hegel. I just want I just want the easy stuff. Let me start there versus all the way to maybe some of your favorite books. Your basic book recommendations, the first question. Then the second being, tell me about the Roger Scruton Legacy Foundation and how one would, what you guys do and how one would get
Mhm.
plugged into that.
Yeah, okay. Two very good questions, much more practical than the rest of this conversation, perhaps. But so starting with Scruton, I would say the most accessible text, and the way, especially if you've never read Scruton or maybe you just read an article or something online, the two books I'd recommend first off is Confessions of a Heretic. So there was a version published in 2015, 2016, something like this. But it's a collection of essays that's been recently republished with a foreword by Douglas Murray and an updated essay in it. But a beautifully bound book, and it's a collection of, I want to say, 12 or 13 essays by Roger, ranging from 2 pages to 20, 25 pages. So they're very digestible, they're very bite sized, and it really gives you the full spectrum of Roger's thought on everything from politics and government to art and philosophy to the environment and building well and all these different things, right? So there was that, even kind of, well, I don't think he talks about sexual relations, but at least interpersonal relations. So there's that book that I'd recommend as just a nice way to kind of get into his philosophy. The other book I'd recommend on a similar note is Gentle Regrets, as I mentioned before, his autobiography, which is kind of a look at his life and what's led him to where he was in maybe his late 50s or 60s, excuse me, but it's a nice reflection and what I think Scruton does really well throughout his philosophy, which is mixing the biographical with the philosophical. So it's not just dry philosophical text, but he's always substantiating it with ideas. um, other touch points, ones that are fun, I think, are News from Somewhere. So that's a series of vignettes from country life, stories that he's written that actually do embody his philosophy in almost a Sartre-like fashion, Jean-Paul Sartre, like fashion, where he's telling you stories and communicating these things to you, but through a way that you grasp what it is he's actually talking about philosophically when he's looking at the environment, when he's looking at his community and what it means to belong to a place and so on and so forth. Another favorite I really like is Modern Culture, which is his look at culture. It's a nice overview, a little bit of philosophy, but it doesn't ever get too dense. But it gives you kind of the anthropological accounts. It gives you the account of modern philosophy and a lot of other stuff. So I'll stop there. That's a lot of recommendations. There's a lot more. yeah, I won't go into any more. Forgive me, Josh. A number come to mind, but there's over 50, so
Yeah,
you'll
yeah.
have a plethora of reading if you want, and plenty online. If you want to see something instead of read something. Forgive me, I'm going on here, but you can find Why Beauty Matters. It's a BBC documentary. Of course, the BBC doesn't allow you to watch it on their site because it's maybe one of the few good things they produced. So they made it terribly difficult to access, but luckily the Brazilians, God bless them, have captured it, because you'll see if you go to Vimeo, I think they have it on Vimeo, there's Portuguese subtitles, and strangely enough, there's a big following of Roger Scruton down in Brazil. Another wonderful thing I've discovered throughout this work. So that's a great hour-long documentary or so, a little less than an hour, looking at Scruton's philosophical view of beauty and giving that kind of visual and audio account, as well as his philosophical account of beauty and an understanding of it in a way that's quite fun, I think. So there's that. Those are at least starting places with Scruton. What we're doing with the Roger Scruton Legacy Foundation, as one might imagine, given our name, is to establish Scruton's legacy. But I think ultimately what this means is trying to establish him as one of the most consequential thinkers of the last 100 years. Not that he isn't already. I think that's already there, and his work is a wide corpus and encapsulates a lot. But it's really trying to find ways in which we can further his work, further his writings, and really what the work of his life. Because Scruton was such an interesting man. He had such a varied life, and he was one of the few, I think, academics that lives out his philosophy. It just wasn't sitting in the ivory tower. It was going out and helping dissidents, in Eastern Europe, smuggling resources and setting up degree awarding programs through universities with dissidents, where they actually have to smuggle in and out student papers, right? Graded, get them back, all these sorts of things. And he set up the Conservative Philosophy Group, which tried to influence British politics. He came to America. He's just very involved in all these very interesting fights, and became a global figure, really. And so I think with the foundation, we're trying to get people to engage with his work, to read his work, to read his writings and talk about it, and hopefully influence their lives in some way around it. But we're also building up a network, I think, of people who are committed to Scruton's philosophy, or at least sympathetic to it, looking at issues in politics and the academy and art and culture, and even in business. I think we ought to have good, businessmen who are conservatives and these sorts of things, or women who are conservatives and are committed to these things. And so really it's about building out this network of people from around the world who care about Scruton's work and want to advance it along with us. So to get involved, I'd recommend, signing up on our website for our newsletters, scruton.org. You can go find. We're on social media. We're having online interviews and different programming that is accessible in that way. So right now we're actually in the middle of an interview series on the environment, looking at Scruton's work and trying to talk with farmers and thinkers from around the world to develop what really is a conservative language and approach for the environment in a little bit more of a cohesive and cogent way. We're working on programs. We host an Oxford seminar for undergraduates, 20 undergraduates for 5 days in Oxford, looking at Scruton's work and thinking about these questions. We host conferences on art and philosophy. There's a lot more going on. So you can find everything there, and get plugged in with the foundation through our website, through our social media pages. And yeah, it's a lot, I know, but it's Scruton, so he is a lot, and there's just so much material and so wide a corpus, like I said, that it's a really fruitful place to start studying and thinking about these questions as a
Uh,
whole.
And that's awesome. Some of these legacy foundations do a little more than collect money and sell books. So it's wonderful you guys are continuing his legacy by doing those many things. Fisher, uh, yeah. Let me try this again. Fisher to Fisher. Yeah. Why am I blanking on your last name?
Derderian.
Derderian. Thank you,
Yeah.
Fisher Derderian. Thank you for taking the time to share all this with us about Roger Scruton and to come on the Saving Elephants program.
Thank you so much, Josh. A real pleasure being here with you today.